My name is Lillian Voss. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent 11 years as a forensic accountant, the last 4 of them specializing in fraud investigation. My father emptied my grandmother's trust account 4 years before she died and forged her signature to do it. I found the withdrawal slip, $46,220, dated 11 days after her stroke, back when she couldn't have signed her own name if her life depended on it. He'd used a pen that skipped on the downstroke, same as always. I recognized the handwriting before I let myself understand what I was looking at. I thought that would be the worst thing I learned about my father. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, a case file landed on my desk with his company's name at the top of it, and I understood, sitting there in my office chair with the fluorescent light humming overhead, that nobody in this building, not my boss, not my father, not my own brother, had any idea what I was about to become to all of them. But here's what none of them knew yet. I'd already opened the drawer where my grandmother kept her old bank statements, and I'd already found what was missing. I keep thinking about a conference room with a folder on the table, and my father's face when he finally understood what was inside it. Welcome to my channel, where we tell the stories that live in the space between what families pretend to be and what they actually are. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, stay with me and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Let me back up. I grew up in a house where my father kept score. Not out loud, Walter Voss never raised his voice if he could help it, because volume was for people who'd lost an argument. He kept score the quiet way. A raised eyebrow when I brought home a B+. A pause, just a half-second too long, before he asked how the numbers thing was going. He built Voss Building Supply from a single lumber lot into 3 locations across western North Carolina, and by the time I was in high school, that company wasn't just what he did. It was who he was. And in his mind, there was exactly one correct way to honor that: you joined it, or you explained yourself. My brother Derek joined it. He was 22, fresh out of a business degree he'd barely finished, and my father handed him a title, operations director, before Derek had learned where the supply yard kept the forklift keys. I was 20, halfway through an accounting degree with a concentration in forensic auditing, and my father asked me, at my own college graduation dinner, why I'd picked the boring version of math instead of a real career. "It's not boring," I told him. "It's finding the truth in the numbers when someone's trying to hide it." He laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively, the way you'd laugh at a kid who said she wanted to be an astronaut. "Nobody's paying good money for that in Asheville, Lillian." I didn't argue. That was never how it worked between us. You didn't argue with Walter Voss, you absorbed what he said, filed it somewhere private, and kept moving. I told myself that was maturity. It would take me a long time to understand it was something closer to fear. For years, that was the shape of us. Sunday dinners at his house, the same table, the same seating, Derek to his right, me across from Derek, my mother's old chair at the end left empty since she'd passed when I was 28. My father asking Derek about quarterly numbers he barely understood, and asking me, if he asked me anything at all, whether I'd met anyone. I built a career anyway. A small firm downtown, then a bigger one, then a senior position doing fraud investigation for regional businesses, insurance claims, embezzlement cases. The kind of work where you spend 6 months looking at a spreadsheet until it finally tells you the truth someone spent 6 months trying to bury. I was good at it. I was quietly, thoroughly good at it, in a way that never once made it onto the radar of a man who measured success by the size of a construction crew. I didn't correct him when he introduced me at parties as my daughter. She does something with numbers. I let it go. That was the thing about my father, everyone let it go. My Aunt Carol used to squeeze my hand under the table when he said things like that, a small, silent apology on his behalf. She never told him to stop either. The morning it started, I was 36 years old, sitting at my desk with a coffee gone cold beside my keyboard, reviewing a batch of new case assignments our office had picked up from the state's fraud division, routine referrals, the kind that come through when an anonymous tip crosses a certain dollar threshold and somebody upstairs decides it's worth a professional look. I opened the 3rd file in the stack and read the company name twice before it landed. Voss Building Supply. I sat very still for a moment. Then I opened the summary page. The complaint had come in 8 weeks earlier. A former bookkeeper dismissed the previous spring, alleging discrepancies in vendor payments going back at least 6 years. Nothing dramatic in the initial filing. No names beyond the companies. Just numbers that didn't reconcile, and a pattern that someone with training would recognize immediately. Payments routed to a vendor account that didn't match any actual supplier on record. I didn't call my supervisor right away. I sat there and read it twice more, my pulse doing something slow and strange in my throat, and I thought about the withdrawal slip still sitting in a folder in my desk drawer at home, the one with my grandmother's forged signature. The one I'd found 4 months earlier and hadn't shown anyone, not even Derek. I hadn't done anything with it. I'd told myself I was still deciding. I wasn't deciding anymore. My supervisor, Nathan, came by my desk around 11 that morning, coffee in hand, doing his usual half-lean against the divider between our cubicles. "You get the Voss file?" he asked, too casually, and something in the way he said it, a beat too smooth, like he'd rehearsed the sentence, made me look up at him a second longer than I normally would have. "I did," I said. "Figured you'd want to recuse. Small town, right? You've got the same last name." He said it like a formality, already reaching for the folder, already assuming the answer. I didn't hand it back. "I can be objective," I said. "It's not even the same branch of the family, as far as anyone here needs to know." That wasn't a lie, exactly. It was a door I left slightly open, and I watched something flicker across Nathan's face, surprise, maybe, or something closer to concern, before he shrugged and let it go. I didn't think much of that flicker at the time. I'd think about it a great deal later. That night I drove to my father's house for our usual Sunday dinner, the file locked in my car's glove compartment, my grandmother's withdrawal slip still folded inside my coat pocket where it had lived for 4 months. My father opened the door in his usual gray cardigan, kissed my cheek the way he always did, brief, formal, more habit than warmth, and asked how the numbers thing was going. "Fine," I said. "Busy season." He nodded like that confirmed something he already believed about me, and led me back toward the kitchen, where Derek was already sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, not looking up. I didn't say anything that night. I sat through the pot roast and the small talk about the Charlotte location's new roof and my father's complaints about supply costs, and I watched him, really watched him, the way I'd learned to watch people for a living, and I noticed, for the first time in longer than I could say, that his hands weren't quite steady around his wine glass. I didn't know yet what that meant. I only knew, driving home afterward with both files sitting 6 inches apart in my car, that whatever came next wasn't going to be something I stumbled into. It was going to be something I chose. Case files don't move fast. That was the first thing I had to explain to myself over and over in the 2 weeks after I opened the Voss folder, that patience wasn't optional, it was the entire method. You didn't build a fraud case by wanting the truth badly enough. You built it one bank statement at a time, one invoice at a time, until the numbers had nowhere left to hide. I requested the standard documentation through official channels, 6 years of vendor payment records, tax filings, and the original complaint from the dismissed bookkeeper, a woman named Renata Cole who'd worked for my father for 9 years before he let her go the previous spring. Her complaint was thin on specifics, but heavy on instinct. She'd noticed a vendor account, Ridgeline Supply Partners, that received regular payments, but never showed up on any delivery manifest she could find. She'd asked about it once. She'd been let go 3 weeks later, officially for restructuring. I read that line 4 times. Restructuring. My father had used that word before, about other things. At home, I kept the Voss file in a locked drawer separate from everything else, and I kept my grandmother's withdrawal slip folded inside an old recipe box in my kitchen, tucked behind a card for a pound cake she used to make. I told myself I was being careful. I didn't examine too closely why careful, lately, had started to look a lot like waiting. Nathan checked in on the case more than he checked in on anything else that month. "How's Voss coming?" he asked on a Tuesday, leaning against my cubicle wall with a coffee he never seemed to actually drink. "Slow," I said. 6 years of vendor records take time to reconcile." Sure. He nodded, glanced at my monitor, not obviously, just a beat too long, then straightened up. Let me know if you need anything expedited. I know Voss Building supplies a decent-sized account for the county. Probably want this handled quickly and quietly. I didn't think much of it in the moment. It was the kind of thing a supervisor said. It was only later, replaying it, that I noticed the word he'd chosen, quietly, sitting slightly wrong, like a shoe on the opposite foot. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when I mentioned the case, offhand, to a friend from the state licensing board, and she said, almost as an aside, that she'd heard Nathan Pruitt had done consulting work for a construction association my father sat on the board of. I hadn't asked her anything about Nathan. She'd volunteered it, the way people volunteer things they don't realize are important. I filed that away too. The recipe box in my kitchen was getting crowded. Underscore 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 underscore. Sunday dinners continued, because that was the rule, unspoken but absolute. You showed up, you ate what was served, you didn't ask questions that made anyone uncomfortable. My father had rebuilt the back deck that spring, and he spent 20 minutes over dinner describing the composite decking material like it was a personal triumph, while Derek nodded along and I watched my father's hands. They weren't steady. I'd noticed it the week before and told myself it was nothing, 68-year-old hands, maybe the start of a tremor, maybe just fatigue. But that night I watched him set his wine glass down twice, both times slightly too hard, both times covering it by immediately reaching for his napkin, like the motion itself was meant to distract from the sound. "You feeling all right, Dad?" I asked, because it seemed like the kind of question a daughter was supposed to ask. "Fine," he said, too fast. "Long week." He answered a different question than the one I'd asked, and neither of us corrected it. Derek was quieter than usual that night, too. He kept his phone face down on the table, which wasn't like him. Derek treated his phone like an extension of his hand, and twice, when my father brought up the Charlotte branch's vendor contracts, Derek changed the subject with a speed that felt almost rehearsed. "You seem distracted," I said to him later, when we were alone in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, my father out on the new deck admiring it in the dark for reasons neither of us questioned. "Just busy," Derek said. "Q3's been a mess." He didn't look at me when he said it. "A mess how?" "Just vendor stuff. Boring stuff." "You wouldn't." He stopped himself. "I wouldn't what?" "Nothing." He shut the dishwasher harder than the dishwasher required. "Forget it." I didn't forget it. I drove home that night turning the moment over, and by the time I reached my apartment, I'd already decided to look more closely at Derek's name on the vendor authorization records the next time I was in the file. It wasn't suspicion, exactly. It was closer to the sensation of a puzzle piece not quite fitting the space it was supposed to fill. If you've ever sat across a dinner table from someone you love, watching them lie to you in small, deniable ways, and told yourself it was nothing, stay with me, because it took me longer than it should have to understand what I was actually looking at. The vendor authorization records, when I finally cross-referenced them the following week, told a story I didn't expect. Ridgeline Supply Partners had been added to the approved vendor list 4 years earlier, and the authorization signature belonged to Derek, his initials, his employee code, time-stamped on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I sat with that for a long moment, my coffee going cold the way it always did lately, and felt something sink in my stomach that I recognized, uncomfortably, as disappointment. Not shock. Disappointment. As though some small, stubborn part of me had been hoping my brother, at least, was not part of whatever this was. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I sat with the printout in front of me and thought about the way he'd flinched at the mention of vendor contracts, the way he'd stopped himself mid-sentence at the sink, and I told myself I was building a case, not a conclusion. Those were different things. I needed to remember that. But that night, for the first time since I'd opened the file, I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark running the timeline in my head, The account opened 4 years ago, my grandmother's stroke 5 years ago, the withdrawal 11 days after it, and something about the proximity of those dates kept snagging on itself. A loose thread I couldn't yet see the shape of. I told myself it was probably nothing. Coincidences happened. Dates overlapped in ordinary lives all the time. I didn't believe myself, even as I thought it. The following Thursday, Aunt Carol called me out of nowhere, something she almost never did on a weekday, and asked, with a carefulness that felt deliberate, whether I'd been looking into anything for work lately. I told her I couldn't discuss active cases. She went quiet for a second too long before saying, of course, and changing the subject to a church fundraiser she wanted my opinion on. I hung up and sat with my phone in my hand for a while. Carol didn't call about fundraisers. Carol called when something worried her enough that she needed to hear a voice tell her it was fine. I didn't call her back that night. I told myself I'd follow up when I had something more concrete to say, to her, to Derek, to any of them. What I didn't let myself examine, not yet, was the fact that I'd started keeping a list in my head of everyone who seemed to already know something was coming, before I'd told a single person outside my office that the file even existed. I went back to the records instead. I pulled bank statements for Ridgeline Supply Partners' registered account, a routine step, public enough not to raise flags, the kind of request that wouldn't reach my father's desk for weeks, if ever. The account had been opened at a credit union 2 counties over. The signatory on the account wasn't Derek. It was my father. I sat looking at the name on my screen for a long time, feeling the shape of the thing I'd been circling finally start to resolve into something with edges. Derek had authorized the vendor. My father controlled where the money actually went. 2 names, 2 different roles, and between them, a 6-year trail of payments to a company that supplied nothing to anyone. I didn't call anyone that night either. I printed the statement, added it to the drawer, and sat in my kitchen with the recipe box open in front of me, my grandmother's withdrawal slip lying next to the Ridgeline printout like 2 pieces of the same unfinished sentence. I still didn't know, that night, how many more pieces there were. I only knew that whatever I found next was going to change which member of my family I was actually building this case against, and I had no idea yet how wrong my first guess would turn out to be. I didn't tell anyone about the credit union statement. Not my supervisor, not Derek, not Carol. I filed it in the drawer with everything else and went back to work the next morning like nothing had shifted, because that was the only way I knew how to hold something this large in pieces, contained, one at a time. But containment has a cost. I started sleeping with my phone face up on the nightstand, waiting for a call I couldn't have named. I stopped finishing my coffee most mornings. Small things. Things I told myself didn't mean anything. The vendor payments to Ridgeline followed a pattern once I laid all 6 years side by side, quarterly, always just under the threshold that would trigger a secondary review, always routed through the same account my father controlled. Whoever built this system understood exactly where the internal audit tripwires sat. That wasn't guesswork. That was someone who'd spent years inside the company's own controls, learning precisely how far they could push before anyone looked twice. Which meant it probably wasn't just my father. I thought about Derek's signature on the authorization form again, and about the way he'd flinched at dinner, and I told myself I was building a case, not a conclusion. I kept telling myself that. It was starting to sound less convincing each time. I requested one more set of records that week, internal accounting staff logs, the kind that showed who'd accessed which files and when. It was a quiet request, routine enough not to raise questions, and it came back 3 days later with a name on it I hadn't expected. Not Derek's. Renata Coles, the bookkeeper my father had fired. Her login had accessed the Ridgeline account records 14 times in the 2 months before her termination. 14 times, digging into an account that, according to her own complaint, she'd only noticed once and questioned once. That didn't match the story she'd told the state. I sat with that discrepancy for a long moment, feeling something shift sideways in my chest, not relief, exactly, but a kind of cold recalibration. Maybe Renata hadn't been an innocent whistleblower stumbling onto something she didn't understand. Maybe she'd known exactly what she was looking at for months and had done nothing until she was fired and had a reason to. Or maybe she'd been trying to fix it. Maybe she'd been the only person in that building with a conscience, digging for evidence to bring to someone, and gotten fired before she could. I didn't know which version was true. For 3 days, I leaned toward the first one, the idea of a woman running her own quiet extraction scheme, using the account for herself, then dressing it up as a complaint when she got caught and let go. It fit. It explained the 14 logins. It explained why she'd waited until termination to say anything at all. It took a phone call from an old contact at the state licensing board to unravel it. Renata Cole, she told me, when I asked, carefully, about the woman's professional history. She flagged something similar at her last job too, few years back, before Voss. Company folded before it went anywhere. She's got a reputation for finding this stuff. Good bookkeeper. Bad luck, twice now, working for men who didn't want to be found out. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after she finished talking. Renata hadn't been running a scheme. She'd been documenting one quietly, methodically, the way someone does when they suspect that whoever they report to might not want the truth to surface. She'd gathered 14 logins worth of evidence because she didn't trust that one glance would be believed. And then she'd been fired for it, and told the state just enough to get someone else looking, without ever naming who she suspected, because I understood this now, sitting in my kitchen with the phone still warm against my palm. She'd probably known exactly whose name was on that credit union account, and known exactly how much power a name like Voss carried in this county. She'd been trying to protect herself as much as expose him. I felt something uncomfortable settle in my stomach, a recognition I didn't want. I understood that impulse better than I wanted to admit. If you've ever built a version of someone in your head, decided who they were before you had the full picture, stay with me, because what I found out about Renata Cole wasn't the last time I'd have to take apart a story I'd already decided was true. I called Renata the following week. Not through official channels, a personal call, off the record, the kind that could get me in trouble if anyone above Nathan found out I'd made it before the investigation formally required it. She answered on the third ring, wary, her voice tightening the moment I said my name. Voss, she repeated. You're not related to him, are you? I hesitated a half-second too long. It's a common enough name in this county, I said, which wasn't a lie and also wasn't an answer, and I heard her breathe out slowly on the other end, like she was deciding whether to trust the omission. I documented everything, she said finally. Sent copies to myself before they let me go. I knew they'd wipe my access the second I stopped being useful. A pause. I didn't put his name in the complaint. I figured if the account led back to him, whoever looked into it would find that themselves. I didn't want to be the one who said it out loud. Not in this town. Why not? Another pause, longer this time. Because men like that don't lose. Not around here. I said his name once, to my old boss at my last job, about something similar, different company, and I was the one who ended up unemployable for a year. I learned my lesson. Let the numbers say it instead of me. I thanked her and hung up, and sat for a long time in my dark kitchen, turning that over. Let the numbers say it instead of me. It was, I realized, exactly what I'd been doing for the past several weeks, building a silent case instead of confronting anyone, hoarding evidence in a locked drawer instead of speaking. I'd told myself it was professional discipline. Listening to Renata, I wondered how much of it was also fear, dressed up as method. 2 days later, I drove out to the county recorder's office on a lunch break, on impulse, to pull the original incorporation papers for Ridgeline Supply Partners, a detail I hadn't yet checked, buried under the more obvious vendor and payment records. It took the clerk 20 minutes to locate the file, and when she finally slid it across the counter, I found a name I hadn't expected among the incorporating parties. Not my father. Not Derek. My Aunt Carol. She was listed as a minority partner in the original filing, 6 years earlier, her signature notarized alongside my father's on a form that had, as far as I could tell from every conversation I'd ever had with her, never once come up. Carol, who called me about fundraisers. Carol, who'd squeezed my hand under the dinner table my whole childhood every time my father dismissed me. Carol, who'd phoned me the week before, careful and strange, asking if I was looking into anything. I stood at that counter for a long moment with the paper in my hands, feeling the ground shift under a version of my family I'd been carrying since I was a child, the idea that my father was the only one capable of this, that everyone else around him was simply enduring him the way I had. I didn't want it to be true. I noticed, with a kind of quiet, uncomfortable clarity, how badly I didn't want it to be true, and how that wanting had nothing to do with the evidence in front of me. I photographed the page. I put the original back exactly where the clerk had filed it, thanked her, and walked back out to my car in the parking lot, where I sat for 10 minutes without starting the engine. I didn't call Carol. I didn't confront her. I told myself I needed more before I said anything to anyone, one more piece, one more confirmation, something that would tell me whether Carol had been a willing partner in this, or something closer to what Renata had been. Someone who'd found herself standing too close to my father's choices, unable to find a way out that didn't cost her everything. But driving home that evening, replaying every phone call, every careful pause, every time she'd squeezed my hand under that table, I understood that the woman I thought I knew best in my family, the one soft place in a house that had never been soft with me, might have been keeping the largest secret of anyone. I didn't know yet how large. I only knew that whatever I found next wasn't going to let me keep believing in the version of Carol I'd built my whole life around. I didn't sleep the night after the recorder's office. I lay awake running through every Sunday dinner I could remember, searching for a version of Carol that made sense of what I'd found. And by morning I had nothing except a headache and a stronger resolve to find out exactly what I was looking at before I let myself feel anything about it. I went back to the beginning. Not the vendor account, not the credit union further back, to the year Ridgeline was incorporated, 6 years earlier. I pulled property records, business filings, anything with a date attached, and laid it all out chronologically on my kitchen table like a woman building a case against her own family, because that was, by then, exactly what I was. The year Ridgeline was formed was the same year my grandmother had her stroke. I sat with that for a long moment before I let myself follow it further. My grandmother, my father's mother, had owned the original lumber lot outright before my father expanded it into what became Voss Building Supply. She'd never fully signed over her ownership stake. I remembered that from childhood, some old family argument about keeping things fair, a phrase my father used to say with a tightness in his jaw that I'd never understood as a kid. I requested the original partnership documents for Voss Building Supply from the State Business Registry, a routine pull, the kind of thing that wouldn't raise a single flag anywhere. What came back changed the shape of everything. My grandmother hadn't just held a stake in the company. She'd held 40% of it, structured through a trust that named 3 beneficiaries upon her death, my father, Derek, and me. Equal thirds. A document drawn up when I was 19 years old, filed and notarized, and never once mentioned to me in the 17 years since. I read it 3 times before it landed. My father had known, for 17 years, that I owned a quarter, through my future third of that 40% of the company he'd spent my entire adult life implying I was too impractical to understand. I didn't tell anyone that night either. I sat at my kitchen table with the recipe box open beside me, my grandmother's forged withdrawal slip lying next to a photocopy of a trust document with my name on it, and I understood, for the first time, why the withdrawal had happened when it did. For years before her death, 11 days after her stroke, right when she was incapacitated enough that she couldn't ask questions, and just before whatever legal process might have formalized her stake into something harder to quietly erode. He hadn't just stolen $46,220 from an old woman who trusted him. He'd been chipping away at something that was never fully his to control in the first place, a trust that would have given his own children real ownership, real voice, real leverage in a company he'd spent his whole life making sure looked like it belonged to him alone. I thought about every time he'd called my career the numbers thing. Every time he'd introduced me at parties as though my work were a hobby. Every dinner where he'd asked Derek about quarterly figures and asked me if I'd met anyone. I'd spent 17 years believing he simply didn't see me as capable. He'd seen me as a threat. He'd just made sure I never knew it. I didn't do anything with the trust document that week. I photographed it, filed the copy in the drawer with everything else, and put the original back in the registry exactly where I'd found it, the way I had at the recorder's office. I told myself I needed to understand the whole shape of it before I moved Derek's role, Carol's role, how deep the account really went, before I let a single person know what I now knew about my own inheritance. It cost me something to wait. 2 days after I found the trust document, Derek called and asked, casually, if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, talk about some family stuff. I could hear something underneath his voice, not quite fear, something closer to a man trying to find the right moment to say something he'd been carrying. I told him I was slammed with a work deadline and would call him back. I never did. I've wondered since whether that was the moment he might have told me everything himself if I'd let him. I still don't know for certain. I only know I chose the case file over the conversation, and I've carried that choice longer than I expected to. I didn't think about it again until the following Tuesday, when Nathan stopped by my desk with the same too-casual posture he'd worn weeks earlier and asked how the Voss case was progressing. Slow, I told him, same as always. You know, he said, glancing at my screen the way he always did, there's a version of this where the whole thing gets handled administratively. Fine, corrective action plan, nobody's name in a headline. Happens all the time with family-owned operations. Cleaner for everyone. He said it lightly, like advice, like something he'd offer any investigator on any case. I told him I'd keep that in mind. I didn't ask him, that day, why he seemed so invested in a clean, quiet outcome for a company that wasn't even his largest account. I filed the comment away instead, next to the memory of my friend from the licensing board mentioning his consulting work for the Construction Association, next to the too smooth way he'd said recuse weeks earlier. 3 small things. None of them proof of anything. All of them sitting the same wrong way in my chest. I still didn't know that week exactly what Nathan's stake in this was. I only knew I'd stopped telling him the full truth about how far along the case actually was, and that felt, for the first time, like the correct decision rather than a paranoid one. If you've ever discovered that the person guiding you through a crisis had their own reasons for wanting it handled a certain way, stay with me, because what I found out about who Nathan actually answered to wasn't something I saw coming either. The last piece came from a source I hadn't expected, an old college friend, Priya, who now worked compliance for the credit union that held the Ridgeline account. I called her on a personal favor, careful with what I asked, careful not to name names until I had to. The accounts had one other signatory added in the last year, she told me, after checking what she could ethically share. Added 6 months ago. Not removed, added alongside the original. Who? Carol Voss. I sat with the phone against my ear, feeling something in my chest go very still. Not 6 years ago at incorporation. 6 months ago. Recently. After Renata had been fired. After the state complaint had been filed. Carol hadn't just been a minority partner from the beginning, quietly aware of something she'd never mentioned. She'd been added as a signatory recently, around the exact time my father would have known the account was at risk of scrutiny, around the exact time he'd have needed someone he trusted to help him move money faster than an investigation could follow it. I thought about her call the week before. Are you looking into anything for work? Not the question of someone innocently curious. The question of someone who already knew, who was trying to find out how much time they had left. I didn't call her. I sat at my kitchen table with all of it laid out in front of me, the forged withdrawal slip, the vendor authorization with Derek's initials, the credit union statement with my father's name, the trust document with mine. And now Carol's signature added 6 months ago to an account built on money that was never fully my grandmother's to take in the first place. I understood, everything I needed. Every piece connected to every other piece, the way a case is supposed to look once you've finally assembled it correctly. I could have called the state that afternoon. I could have handed the whole thing to Nathan, whatever his reasons for wanting it handled quietly, and let the process run its course through channels I no longer entirely trusted. I didn't. I put every document back exactly where each one belonged, the state trust filing, the recorder's copy, the credit union records, all of it returned to its proper place, untouched, as though I'd never been there at all, and I sat with what I now knew privately. Telling no one, for 3 more weeks. I told myself I was being thorough, building a case that couldn't be picked apart. That was true as far as it went. But sitting there that night, I understood something else too, something I wasn't ready to say out loud even to myself. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was deciding, piece by piece, exactly how and when my father was finally going to find out that the daughter he'd spent 17 years calling impractical had been holding the one thing that could take everything from him, and that she'd known it, silently. For weeks, while he kept calling her the numbers thing across a dinner table, he had no idea was already gone. I didn't know yet that the moment I'd chosen for that reckoning was going to arrive faster than I'd planned, forced into motion by someone I hadn't even considered a variable in any of this. I hadn't planned to move that week. I'd told myself I needed at least one more month, one more layer of documentation, one more corroborating source, before I decided how and where to bring it forward. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, Nathan called me into his office and closed the door, and I understood the timeline had just been taken out of my hands. "I got a call from someone on the county commission," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Asking whether the Voss case was close to resolution. Asking, specifically, whether it might be handled before the ribbon cutting for the new Charlotte location next week." "Who called you?" "Doesn't matter who called me." He shuffled a folder that didn't need shuffling. "What matters is I think it's time to close this out. Administrative resolution. I already drafted language for a corrective action agreement, no charges, repayment plan, case sealed. I need you to sign off on it by Friday." I sat there for a moment, understanding exactly what was happening. Somebody, my father, or someone close enough to him, had found out the investigation was further along than they'd expected, and had reached over Nathan's head, or through him, to make it disappear before it could reach a courtroom or a headline. "I can't sign off on that," I said. "The evidence doesn't support administrative resolution. It supports fraud, and it's not one person, it's at least three." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Lillian." "I need until Monday," I said. "That's it. Monday." He didn't agree to it. He also didn't stop me from walking out of his office with the file still in my bag. I called my father that night and told him I needed to see him alone, without Derek, without Carol. I didn't tell him why. He agreed to Sunday, before the regular dinner, in his study, the way we used to talk when I was a teenager, and he had something to correct me about. I spent the 3 days before that meeting doing exactly what I'd done for weeks, preparing. I organized the documents in the order I intended to present them, oldest to newest, the way you'd walk a courtroom through a case. I rehearsed nothing else. I told myself the facts would carry the room, and that I didn't need a speech, only a sequence. I didn't call Derek. I didn't call Carol. I decided, driving to my father's house that Sunday afternoon with a folder on the passenger seat, that whatever happened in that study would happen the way I'd built it, quietly, in order, undeniable. I hadn't accounted for the fact that my father wouldn't be alone. When I walked into the study, Derek was already sitting in the chair by the window, and Carol was standing near the bookshelf with her arms crossed, a posture I recognized from every family disagreement I'd ever watched her referee. My father sat behind his desk like he was receiving me for a business meeting, hands folded, composed. "I told them we should all be here," he said, before I'd even sat down. "If this is about the company, it affects all of us. No secrets in this family, Lillian." He said it evenly, almost warmly, and I understood immediately that he believed he had already won whatever this was going to be, that he'd assembled his own room, his own witnesses, his own narrative, before I'd said a single word. I sat down across from him anyway. "I've been assigned to a fraud investigation," I said. "Voss Building Supply." I should have recused myself. I didn't. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, or the specific stillness of a man recalculating in real time. He didn't flinch outwardly. "You should have told me you were involved," he said. "That's a conflict of interest, isn't it? Could get you in trouble." "It could," I agreed. "That's not why I'm here." I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I laid the documents on his desk one at a time, in the order I'd rehearsed. The withdrawal slip first, my grandmother's forged signature turned to face him. 11 days after her stroke, I said. $46,220. She couldn't have signed this. He looked at it for a long moment. "I don't know what you think that proves." I placed the next document beside it, the Ridgeline Incorporation filing, Carol's name circled. I heard her breath catch behind me, but I didn't turn around. 6 years old, I said. You needed a minority partner who wouldn't ask questions. That's not, Carol started and stopped. I placed the vendor authorization form next, Derek's initials visible. Derek didn't say anything at all. He was staring at the desk like he'd already known this moment was coming for longer than any of us had realized. Last, I placed the trust document, my own name on it, notarized 17 years ago, never once mentioned to me. I own a third of 40% of this company, I said. I have since I was 19. You never told me. The room went very quiet. I said less than any of them expected me to say. I let the papers do the part I'd spent weeks deciding not to say out loud myself. You don't understand what it took to keep this company running, my father said finally, and his voice had changed, not louder, but harder, the practiced calm of a man used to being the only person in any room who got to explain things. Your grandmother wanted to sell the lot in the 90s. I talked her out of it. I built this from a gravel yard. Every board decision, every risk, every year I didn't take a salary so the crew could get paid, that was me. That trust was drawn up so nobody could take it out from under me before it was finished being built. You'd have sold your share the second some lawyer offered you a number. I was protecting the company. You were protecting yourself, I said. I was protecting all of us, he said, and something in the way he said it, too smooth, too immediate, told me he'd said some version of this sentence to himself many times already, long before I'd walked into that room. Carol moved first, not toward me, and not toward him. She stepped back from the bookshelf and sat down heavily in the chair nearest the door, her arms unfolding, her composure finally cracking. I told you 6 years ago this wasn't right, she said quietly, to my father, not to me. I told you to just give the girl her share and be done with it. Carol. I signed that paperwork because you told me it was temporary. A structure. You said it was so the bank wouldn't freeze accounts during probate. You never said, she stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. You never said it would still be running 6 years later. My father's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. He also didn't confirm it. This isn't the time, he said, to Carol, in the voice he used to end conversations. When is the time, Walter? Carol's voice cracked. When she's 40. 50? Derek hadn't said anything at all. When I finally looked at him, his face was pale, his hands loosely knotted together, and I understood, watching him, that whatever he'd wanted to tell me over coffee 3 weeks earlier had been exactly this, that he'd known, at least in part, and hadn't found the nerve to say it before I found it myself. I didn't know about the withdrawal, Derek said finally, quietly, not looking at either of us. I swear I didn't know about that part. The vendor account, I thought it was legitimate when I signed off on it. I asked questions later. He told me not to worry about it. And you didn't worry about it, I said. Derek didn't answer that. My father stood up from behind his desk, and for a moment I thought he might come around it, might try something, an apology, a reversal, the kind of performance I'd half expected walking in. Instead, he stayed where he was, hands braced flat against the desk, and looked at me with an expression I'd never once seen on him in 36 years, something closer to fear than anger. What do you want, Lillian? He said. It wasn't really a question. I want you to understand, I said, that I'm not deciding anything in this room. I already decided. I decided 3 weeks ago, and I put every document back exactly where I found it, and I let the case build itself the way it was always going to. This isn't a negotiation. I came here to tell you it's already done. I stood, gathered the papers back into their folder, and looked at my father one more time, not with anger, not with the satisfaction I'd half expected to feel, but with something closer to the quiet exhaustion of finally setting down something I'd been carrying since I was 20 years old. The state's fraud division will have the full file by Monday morning, I said. I'm not the one who decides what happens after that. Nobody in this room is anymore. I walked out of the study, past Carol, who reached for my hand the way she had my whole childhood and found it already gone, past Derek, who said my name once and didn't finish the sentence, and out into the hallway where I could hear my father's voice, low and urgent, already talking to someone else before I'd even reached the front door. I didn't stop to listen to what he was saying. I'd already heard everything I needed to. Monday morning, I submitted the complete file to the State Fraud Division through official channels, along with a formal notice of recusal and a letter documenting exactly why I hadn't recused sooner. I expected consequences for that. I was prepared for them. What I hadn't expected was how quickly everything else moved once the file was out of my hands. The state opened a formal investigation within the week. Nathan was reassigned off any case connected to Voss Building Supply, and 2 months later, quietly, resigned from the firm altogether. I never learned the full extent of what he'd been asked to do on my father's behalf. Only that his name came up twice in interviews the state investigators conducted, and that he never spoke to me again after the day I handed in that file. I didn't chase an explanation. Some things you let stay unfinished. My father was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraud in the operation of Ridgeline Supply Partners. He avoided prison. His attorney negotiated a settlement that included full restitution to my grandmother's estate, a 5-year probation period, and removal as an officer of Voss Building Supply. The company itself survived, restructured under new ownership terms that finally reflected the trust as it had always legally existed. I own my third. I've used almost none of the money. I mostly wanted my name on the paperwork the way it should have been for 17 years. Carol wasn't charged. She cooperated fully once the investigation opened, gave a statement that corroborated everything I'd found, and testified, when it came to that, about what my father had told her when he asked for her signature 6 years earlier. It cost her something anyway. She and my father don't speak. She told me once, months later, that she'd rather have nothing than keep protecting something that was never protecting her back. Derek kept his job at the company, technically, though it's a smaller company now and a smaller job. We don't talk often. When we do, there's a carefulness between us that wasn't there before, not hostility, just distance, the kind that comes from knowing someone let you find out the hard way what they could have told you themselves. I didn't see my father again for 4 months after that Sunday in his study. The first time was at a deposition, both of us on opposite sides of a conference table, lawyers between us, and neither of us said anything beyond what the proceedings required. The second time was different. He called me in early spring, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, and asked if I'd come by the house. Just to talk, he said. Not about the case. I almost didn't go. I sat with the invitation for 2 days, turning it over the way I'd turned over every piece of evidence for the past several months, and in the end, I went because some part of me still needed to see, with my own eyes, what was left of him once everything he'd built his image around had finally come apart. He was sitting on the back deck when I arrived, the composite decking he'd once described to me for 20 straight minutes over dinner, weathered now, a little duller than it had been. He didn't stand when I came out. He just gestured at the chair across from him, and I sat. "I'm not going to apologize the way you probably want me to," he said, after a long silence. "I don't know if I have that in me. I've spent so long being the version of myself I built this company to be, I'm not sure what's underneath it anymore." I didn't say anything. I let him keep talking the way I'd learned to, in a room, letting the silence do more work than a response would have. "I told myself I was protecting the company," he said. "For years. I still believe some part of that was true. But I think," he started again. "I think somewhere along the way protecting the company and protecting myself from ever being seen as anything less than the man who built it became the same thing in my head. I couldn't tell you where one ended and the other began anymore. It was the closest thing to honesty I'd ever heard from him. It wasn't an apology. I understood, sitting there, that it might be the only version of one he was capable of giving. "I own a third of what's left," I said finally. "Not because I fought you for it. Because it was already mine. You spent 17 years making sure I never knew that, and calling me impractical the whole time you knew exactly how capable I was, capable enough to be worth hiding something from." He didn't argue with that. He just nodded, once, and looked out at the yard, and I understood that whatever he was carrying now, he was going to carry it mostly alone, the way he'd built everything else in his life, quietly, without letting anyone close enough to help. I stayed another 20 minutes. We didn't talk about the case again. When I left, he walked me to the door, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, He hugged me brief, awkward, more habit than warmth, the same way he always had. But he held it half a second longer than usual, and I let him. I still wonder, sometimes, whether that half-second longer was regret, or simply the closest he could come to it. I drove home that evening with the windows down, the spring air finally warm enough to matter, and pulled into my apartment complex just as the sun was setting behind the ridgeline west of the city, the actual ridgeline. The one the fake company had borrowed its name from, greener now than it had been all winter. I went inside, set my keys on the counter, and opened the recipe box that had sat in my kitchen for the better part of a year, the withdrawal slip and every photocopy still tucked behind my grandmother's pound cake recipe. I didn't need to keep them there anymore. The originals were with the state now, the case closed, the restitution processed. I took the folded slip out, looked at it one last time, her signature, and beneath it, in the same pen that skipped on the downstroke, the forgery that had started all of it, and I put it back in the box anyway. Some things you don't need for evidence. You keep them because they're still yours. I closed the lid. I still wonder, sometimes, whether my father ever really believed he was protecting us, or whether that was simply the version of the story he needed to survive telling himself. I don't think I'll ever know for certain, and I've stopped needing to. That's my story. A forged signature, a locked drawer, a recipe box that held more truth than anyone at that dinner table for years. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this found something familiar in your own life, tell me in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story. What's strange about being underestimated your whole life is that it can hide the exact thing someone is most afraid of about you. Lillian's father didn't dismiss her career because he thought it was worthless. He dismissed it because a woman trained to find hidden money was the one person in his family capable of finding his. The chain here started small and compounded. A forged signature 11 days after a stroke, made when no one was positioned to question it, became a shell vendor account 4 years later, which became a family structured around silent complicity, a sister who signed because she was told it was temporary, a son who authorized because he was told not to worry, a supervisor who nudged toward quiet resolution because someone above him made a phone call. None of these people set out to build a conspiracy. Each one made one compromise, told themselves it was smaller than it was, and the next compromise became easier because of it. That's usually how families like this operate, not through one dramatic betrayal, but through years of people agreeing not to look too closely, in exchange for peace or approval, or simply not being the one who causes the trouble. What Lillian's silence cost her is worth sitting with too. Her patience built an airtight case. It also meant she carried the truth about her own inheritance, her aunt's complicity, her brother's near confession, entirely alone for months, protecting a process instead of a relationship. There's no clean answer to whether that was the right trade. Some things can only be resolved with evidence. Some things quietly cost you a chance at an earlier, messier, more honest conversation. The company survived. The family didn't, not in its old shape. What's left is smaller, more honest, and considerably less comfortable, which is often what's actually on the other side of exposing something that was never supposed to see daylight. Where in your own life have you mistaken someone's silence for peace, when it was actually the sound of something being managed instead of resolved?